Hello. My name is Munchkin, and today I want to talk about Moominvalley 2019, and specifically about the way that characters are presented in the show. Specifically, I want to talk about Snork and Snufkin and the traits of autism that they both express. I want to start off by saying that I am not a clinically licensed psychiatrist. I don't have any experience with psychology other than studying it in university. This is not a diagnostic video. This is just me ranting about something that I'm very, very interested in, because I have autism and I struggle with a lot of the things that comes with autism, and I want to put my thoughts out there in a consumable fashion, which is why I am making a video so that other people can hear me talk about my hyperfixations and my interests. So this is not a scientific video. I don't have scripts. I don't do well with scripts. I can't read off of scripts, and I'm sorry preemptively. I have speech impediments. I stutter a lot. I forget the right words to use. I call it like I have a verbal dyslexia. I have a really hard time speaking, but I am making this video because I want to talk to people about things, because I am really, really passionate about the Moomins, and I really like talking about them, and I want to talk to other people, and maybe I can find other people online who really, really like the Moomins and who want to talk about things. I also want to apologize for the audio quality. It is not always going to be good. There's going to be noises. I have a dog. She snores very loudly. And I tend to ramble a lot. But anyway, I want to talk about the Moomins. I want to talk about specifically Moominvalley 2019, because that's the one that I've been watching most recently, and I really, really love the show, and I want to talk about autism, and specifically, like I said, Snork and Snufkin, because while I think it's sort of accepted in the fandom that Snork has autism, or is at least some flavor of neurodivergent, I don't see as much of a conversation about Snufkin having autism, and personally, I pegged him as being autistic right from the start. He has a lot of traits that I experience as someone who is autistic, and so I want to do a kind of comparison between what I'm going to call the classical presentation of autism in media that we see from Snork. Not necessarily classical in the sense that it's derogatory or bad or stereotypical or anything like that. It's not a negative, but it is more what people expect to see from autism. And then, to me, at least, Snufkin is a very, not necessarily classical presentation, but it is realistic to me. I'm not saying Snork is unrealistic, it's just between the two, I relate more to Snufkin and relate more to the way that I view his autism as expressing. And I would like to talk about those two different presentations and what they might mean for the characters, and I would also like to have a wider discussion on the different ways in which autism can present. But yeah, like I said, I'm not a licensed psychiatrist. We're not going to be diagnosing the characters with neurodivergency. That is not the point of this video. It's not, we're not going to be referring to any scientific papers or anything like that, other than some scientific concepts may be talking about specific symptoms and stuff like that, but this is not a research paper or anything like that. And like I said, I only am talking about Snufkin because I personally read him as autistic. This video is not going to be for you if you don't like to hear someone rambling, if you want really busy imagery on screen, I don't know, like, I'm not going to be using any video clips because I don't have access to any of the Moominvalley video clips except for season 1, and most of the video clips, of course, pertaining to Snork are in the later seasons. I only have season 1 as a video clip, and therefore I'll mostly be using still images. And there's not going to be a lot happening in terms of editing. But yeah, so if you don't like, or if you don't like talking about autism and character analysis, then this is also not going to be a video for you. But if you just want to listen to one autistic being rambling about the things that he's interested in, then stick around, because there's going to be a lot of that. I want to talk about, so specifically, let's start by talking about Snork. Now, I said that Snork has a very classical expression of neurodivergency, and in this case I'm going to be referring mostly to autism, because that's the flavor of neurodivergency that I have. Snork has a very classical presentation. So when I talk about classical, I talk about the things that non-neurodivergent people, I don't remember the word for non-neurodivergent right off the top of my head right now. Words are fiction. They don't exist. Sometimes they just disappear. So non-neurodivergent people have a specific view of what they typically think autism is. And a lot of the time it is strange obsessions, so that would be our special interests, very literal way of thinking, not having a sense of humor, taking things way too seriously, being... what's the word? What would the word be? Non-budging? Being stubborn about the way that you view the world. And I don't know if this is coming across as negative. I'm not necessarily saying these are negative traits. I'm just saying that this is how I typically find people view people like us who have autism from an outside perspective. And Snork has a lot of these traits. Snork is definitely portrayed as having a very literal way of thinking about things. He is, an example is he misunderstands jokes, and we know that because, or misunderstands references as well. We see that with the, you can be my Snork Friday, but it's Sunday. And because he takes it seriously that it's not Friday, it's Sunday. There was also the reference in, I think it was Moomin Mama's Flying Dream, where Moomin Troll says, "I know you won't let me down," because he was tied with a rope to the ceiling. And then Snork's like, "Oh, that had an amusing double meaning to it, didn't it? I'm getting the hang of this." He doesn't necessarily grasp jokes unless they... I don't really see him grasping jokes at all, but he views things very literally, and that can make him come across as not really having a sense of humor. That's not to say that he doesn't have a sense of humor, it's just that that's the way that he can come across. He has a very strict way of looking at things. Like, he says that, I think Sniff says, "A little lie never hurt anyone," and then he replies with, "Yes, they do, they confuse things." And he has a view of there is no such... Effectively, he comes across as having a view of there is no such thing as a harmless lie. There's no such thing as a lie which can be to the benefit of someone. And we see more of this in... in Inventing Snork, where he has a hard time giving people compliments if he's not actively believing what he's saying. He has a hard time accepting that some people just do not want to exercise. Like, Muskrat does not want to exercise, and according to Snork, the truth is that he needs exercise. And he has a hard time understanding the perspective of Muskrat, in that Muskrat has no interest in exercise. He views exercise as a detriment to his happiness, to his well-being, And because Snork doesn't understand changing his perspective to match someone else's, he has a really hard time accepting telling Muskrat that it's okay to indulge in snacks, and he doesn't understand how that can in some cases be the better thing to do. Now, I think the way that Mizabel was treated was an obvious case of she was not happy in being, I'm gonna call it like glamorized. She wasn't having a good time. She didn't want to do that. But in some cases, it is true that people don't want to hear the truth. And they want to be told things that reassures them rather than what is necessarily literally truthful. A good example is it doesn't necessarily help to tell Sniff that he is a coward. Yes, Sniff is a coward, but telling Sniff that he is a coward doesn't necessarily improve his situation. Or let's take Muskrat for an example again. Muskrat is likely going to see physical improvements if he adopts a regular habit of exercise. That doesn't necessarily mean that it would improve his overall mental health, his overall happiness and well-being of life. So forcing him to do exercise is actually somewhat potentially detrimental. It really depends on the person. But Snork has a hard time seeing past the statistics and seeing each individual circumstance for what they might be. Or another good example is Snork asks Moomintroll what he sees. They look at the plants and he asks Moomintroll what he sees. And Moomintroll replies he sees pathways to adventure. And Snork immediately replies, but you can't really see that, that's not real. And then proceeds to explain how he views things as completely categorized and into their different species and demographics. But the thing is, the way that it is showed on screen, you can't literally see that either. You can't literally see them grouped together. You have to imagine that. And Snork has a hard time accepting that someone else could literally see pathways to adventure, because he can't see pathways to adventure. To him, that's not real. You cannot see that. But that doesn't mean that Moomin can't see pathways to adventure. To him, what he might see instead of a tree branch, he might see a potential swing, and that's just as literal and just as valid as Snork's envisioning of the different species and categories, but Snork has a very hard time putting himself in someone else's shoes. And again, these are not necessarily criticisms or flaws or me saying, oh, that's a bad thing, you should be able to do that. It's just an analysis of how this character behaves. So that is a very classical way of how people view autistic people. So how they view our symptoms. Another good example is Snork is very vocal about disliking certain stimulations. He obviously doesn't like balloons because balloons will pop, and that makes him very uncomfortable. He doesn't like the surprise of a balloon popping, that loud sound. He doesn't like loud music. He doesn't like bright colors necessarily. They can be very, especially when put together, they can be very overwhelming. And that view of someone who is easily overstimulated, easily overwhelmed by a lot of stimulation, that is a very classical or neurotypical, that's the term I was thinking about. That's a very neurotypical understanding of what autism is like. And that's not necessarily incorrect, because a lot of people do experience things like that. A lot of people do experience the loud music and the balloons, the colors of the balloons, the many people to be immediately overwhelming, and they don't like that stimulation. It's not necessarily inaccurate, it is just a very commonly accepted by the outside populace view of autism. So he also dislikes physical touch, so we know that from Moomin Mama's Flying Dream. So from Moomin Mama's Flying Dream, we know that he also dislikes physical touch, which is incredibly valid. Not everybody likes physical touch, and for a lot of people with autism, it can be incredibly overstimulating, so that's perfectษ์valid. I do know a lot of autistic people do not like physical touch, and you don't even have to be autistic to not like physical touch, but it's just a thing that a lot of people who are autistic do have. And then also he has his very relatable and unfortunately stereotypical special interest, which is inventing. He likes engineering, he likes problem solving, he likes I'm gonna call it STEM autism. He like science, engineering, technology, something, technology and math, something like that. He likes your classical diagrams and numbers and scientifically organizing plants into their different species autism. And again, that's a very valid form of autism. It is just also, unfortunately, very stereotypical. When people think of autism, they typically think, when I say people, I'm not talking about autistic people, I'm talking about neurotypical people. When neurotypical people think of autism, they typically think of like, oh, you're good at maths, or you're obsessed with numbers, or you're a really good engineer. And that's, again, a perfectly valid form of autism, just also a very stereotypical form of autism and autism expression. And that is why I describe Snork as having a classical expression of autism. So pretty much what neurotypical people think autism should look like. And on the other end, not necessarily the other end, but in the other case, the other hand, the other situation, we have Snufkin. And Snufkin has, in my opinion, a very subtle and easy to miss presentation of autism. But to me, the symptoms are very clear. As someone who experiences very similar symptoms, to me it is very, very clear that he is autistic, or at least some flavor of neurodivergent. And the first symptom that Snufkin has, which is to me both the most blatant and the most interesting, is Snufkin has extreme pathological demand avoidance. Now, if you don't know what pathological demand avoidance is, pathological demand avoidance is a symptom, it can be its own thing, but it's usually a symptom of autism. So, people who are not autistic can absolutely experience pathological demand avoidance for a myriad of other reasons, but it is very often a symptom of autism. And what it is you experience extreme stress or anxiety when asked to do something. And so it comes from an external or internal demand, an expectation, a responsibility. And anyone who's watched the Moominvalley, any of the Moomin series, really know that Snufkin does not do well with responsibility. He is not cut out for that sort of thing. Now, there are various different ways that pathological demand avoidance can express, and I will mainly be talking about the stress that comes from a demand. And I should clarify that a demand can be anything. It can be an implied demand, so it can be like, you are going to a social gathering. You know that when you go to a social gathering, you are expected to mingle with the guests. Nobody explicitly tells you, go talk to that person, but you know that you are expected to talk to that person via, most likely prior experience. Prior experience, you know that you're expected, or let's say you're going to a birthday party, you are expected to wish the person who is having a birthday happy birthday. And knowing that that's expected of you, that there's some level of responsibility on you, causes you to experience internal stress. It causes an adrenaline response. It causes you to want to fight or flight. Usually it's more of an anxiety response, like you want to leave the situation, you want to avoid doing the thing. This can also express as a form of social anxiety. You get anxious when you are expected to communicate with other people, because there are just so many rules that you have to follow, so many expectations that you must meet, that it becomes overwhelming and stressful. And oftentimes pathological demand avoidance takes a more literal form in that you avoid doing specific tasks. So you might know that you should wash the dishes today. The dishes have piled up. There are a lot of them. You have to wash the dishes. But because there is this voice in your head saying that you have to wash the dishes, it feels like there's a demand on you to wash the dishes. And because there's that demand, that expectation, it becomes incredibly stressful, and you want to avoid it. So demand can be external, that can be implied, an implied demand. It can be a direct demand, so it can be someone literally telling you, go wash the dishes. It can be that nobody else in the house has washed the dishes, and you know that usually you relent and you wash the dishes, so you know that there's that expectation on you to wash the dishes. Or you can be living by yourself, and it can be an internal demand, like you can be giving yourself the task that you need to wash the dishes. And even that internal demand, that's something you set for yourself, can be incredibly stressful. And it can sometimes come across as a defiance, like, you can't make me wash the dishes. How dare you expect me to do that? And Snufkin experiences this a lot. This is actually one of his core personality traits, kind of like his core features. One of the things that is consistent with Snufkin is that he doesn't do well with responsibility. But more importantly, he doesn't do well with expectation. He doesn't respond well to realizing that there is something that is expected of him. And we can see this even in the second episode of the series. Snufkin has a routine. He goes to Moominvalley in the spring, he stays there from spring to fall, and then leaves at the end of fall to go to the Lonely Mountains, and then he spends winter in the Lonely Mountains and he returns. And we know that this is a routine that he follows almost every year. Sometimes there are some inconsistencies. Sometimes he leaves earlier or he arrives later. But generally speaking, that is a routine that he follows, and he's happy to follow that routine. He wants to go back to Moominvalley, and he wants to see Moomintroll, and he wants to leave in the winter, and he wants to be by himself. But we see in the second episode with TT Woo that when TT Woo brings up this routine, as soon as TT Woo says that you will go to Moominvalley soon, and you will go see Moomintroll, all of a sudden, that routine that he's made for himself turns into an expectation. He now has to return to Moominvalley. Someone else, or even his internal will, is telling him he has to go to Moominvalley. He has to see Moomintroll. And normally, that pattern of behavior would be comforting. It would be a ritual. It would be soothing to do. But because it has now suddenly turned into an expectation, it becomes incredibly stressful instead. And you see him lash out like, maybe I won't go to Moominvalley at all. Maybe I'll go when I want to. I have control. And nature itself knocks him over the head with that statement when he says he won't go at all. But it is very relatable as an autistic person who suffers from pathological demand avoidance that we need to have control over our own lives. We need to have control over what we do, and we feel incredibly threatened when we feel that that control has been taken away from us, even by ourselves. We tend to fear attachment and we fear routine, which is incredibly ironic, because a lot of the time, again with classical presentation of autism, it's viewed as, oh, you have to have a routine, you have to have these things that you do over and over and over again. And that is true. We do find comfort in routine, and we do find comfort in doing things the same way over and over again. But the problem is that we have to feel like that was our choice. It was our choice to do it over and over again, and it was our choice to form this routine. And we have control. If someone is challenging our routine, then we can be like, no, it's our routine, you can't touch it. And that's like a form of resistance. But as soon as someone tries to reinforce the routine, it starts feeling as though they're trying to take control away from us. They're trying to make us do something that we no longer want to do. They're trying to utilize our routine as an excuse and a method to tell us what to do, and that is incredibly stressful. It's not always accurate. It's usually actually not. Usually people don't want to wrestle control away from us. But for people like myself who have pathological demand avoidance, it is incredibly difficult to get over that instinctive fear, that stress that comes from feeling as though somebody is trying to have control over your life. And we tend to be very protective and very preemptively offensive over what we want to do in our routines, and usually the people who suffer from pathological demand avoidance and other forms of almost rebellion regarding our autistic traits, we were people who grew up in situations where our autism wasn't respected. Our interests, our needs, our boundaries were not respected, and so we are now incredibly sensitive over having those boundaries taken away or having that control taken away. Snufkin, even though it's his routine, it's his choice, and it makes him incredibly happy to have that yearly routine, and he wants to go see Moomintroll, he really does, but feeling as though he is attached, feeling as though he is losing control over that aspect of himself is incredibly, incredibly stressful to him. That is an example of having a ritual kind of usurped into pathological demand avoidance. But we can also see symptoms of pathological demand avoidance from unexpected things that come up. Snufkin has a very different response based on whether or not a task is something he adopts by himself or if a task is imposed on him. If he is by chance encounters fire spirit, right? He gladly takes on the responsibility of taking that fire spirit to the volcano because he doesn't feel like he has to. He feels like that was his choice. He chose to take the fire spirit to the volcano, and he has control over that choice. But when we see him in Snufkin and the Fairground, when he accidentally gets given the responsibility of running the fairground, that is a completely different situation that we see him in. And suddenly there's all this stress, there's all this anxiety about the responsibility. The episode The Fire Spirit and the episode Snufkin and the Fairground, in both episodes we see Snufkin have an immense responsibility. Climbing a volcano just to return a fire spirit is not a menial task. It's not easily done. but he happily does it because no one told him to do it. With the fairground, he feels as though he doesn't have a choice, and he himself even says that at the end of the episode, he doesn't think that running a fairground is for him, especially since he had no choice in doing it. He didn't have a say in being handed the tickets, and he didn't have a say in the kids viewing him as someone who is now running the fairground. But when presented with an issue and freely taking on the responsibility to handle that issue, he's actually pretty capable, and he's actually fairly calm despite the responsibility. And again, to me, that is a very clear example of pathological demand avoidance. It's not that he is incapable of responsibility. He is incapable of responsibility when he has to acknowledge that he has that expectation and other people are relying on him. If it's something that he is doing without thinking about the element of responsibility, it's a lot easier on him. And that's something that I can personally deeply relate to. I love doing things for other people. I love helping people. One of my favorite things to do is to help people. But as soon as I feel like I have no choice, as soon as I feel like I have a responsibility, it starts scaring me a lot. I develop incredible stress. I get sick. I get physically sick from the stress. I am a very productive person when I'm doing something like my art. I love drawing. I love writing. I love making things. But if you tell me to write an essay, oh no, it's never getting done. It is not happening because I can't handle it. And that's something I deeply relate to Snufkin to, in that it's not about the responsibility, it's about the control, and in some cases it's also about letting other people down. The fear of failure. It's the fear of it's the stress from responsibility and the fear of failure, and they both kind of go hand in hand to create pathological demand avoidance. That is the biggest and most obvious symptom that Snufkin expresses. And the main reason why I immediately was like, this boy is autistic, obviously, 100%, there's no doubt in my mind. But there are some other symptoms as well, which I would like to point out before we start comparing Snork and Snufkin and their individual expressions of autism. So, Snufkin also has a very black and white way of thinking. Much like Snork's literal way of thinking, there is a right way to do something and there is a wrong way to do something. And he's not as strict about it, but he does voice his opinion on things quite often, and he would say something like, it's not love, it's possession, when talking about the hobgoblin's obsession with the king's ruby. And he very clearly strongly believes that. Now, he can't know this for sure. He hasn't, as far as we know, he hasn't met the hobgoblin. They haven't had a sit down, they haven't had a discussion about the inner psychological reasoning for why the hobgoblin is doing what he's doing, but he is very adamant that the hobgoblin doesn't love the king's ruby, he wants to possess it, and possession of something is wrong. Similarly, he has a very strong belief that parks are wrong, and that kind of ties in with possession as well. You can't possess nature, it's not okay to possess nature, but in some ways it's also confinement. You're not allowed to confine nature, and he has a very strong belief in that. A park is not necessarily a bad thing. There's nothing inherently wrong with a park, unless it's siphoning water from the local ecosystem, or if it's otherwise damaging the local ecosystem. He just instinctively disagrees with the manufactured method of containing animals and plants in a park setting, and he has a bit of an issue of authority, and he doesn't like the signs, and I can relate to that. But generally speaking, it's just a very strong belief that he has that containing plants is wrong. You shouldn't try to force a plant to look a specific way. You shouldn't contain nature. That's just wrong. He doesn't provide much reasoning for this, and I'm not saying that he is incorrect in his assertion that parks are wrong. It's just that is a fundamental belief that he holds, and it's very black and white. It's either you have a park and you're doing things wrong, or you're not having the park and it's fine. It's nature, it's free, it's good. Nature is good, parks are bad. He also, much like Snork, has a very hard time seeing things outside of his own motivations and seeing it from other people's perspective. That's not to say that he can't. He's actually, in my opinion, better at seeing other people's perspective when presented with the fact that there is an alternate perspective than Snork is, but he still has some difficulty. A good example is when he says that the fairground keeper had the right idea. He's stressed in that situation, which is also making his symptoms probably more evident. But he says that the fairground keeper had the right idea, and it's because in that moment he is stressed and he wants to leave and he wants to run away from the situation, but he doesn't notice or figure out that this is maybe not the right thing to say in that instance, because from his friend's perspective, they're doing this for him, and that is dismissive of the effort that they put in, and it is in some ways insensitive to not see the perspective of his friends in their motivations for helping him, and only focusing on his own immediate situation that he is stressed out and he wants to run away. It's not a bad thing necessarily, he just has a harder time noticing that other people are the reason why other people are doing certain things, and especially how his actions relate to them. Another good example is not realizing that the punishment that he gave to the park keeper in Snufkin and the Park Keeper was maybe a bit extreme. He finds it incredibly funny, and honestly, it is incredibly funny to see the park keeper, quote unquote, shining like a moon. But he is being electrocuted, and Snufkin doesn't seem to quite realize how brutal the punishment of exposing someone to new-grown hattie fatteners might be. He is a little bit absorbed in his own current situation of this is funny. It's not that he's unempathetic, it's just that he needs a little bit of an extra push for the empathy to really register that what he's doing is affecting other people, and he only really realizes that about halfway through the episode when Moomintroll and Snork Maiden get arrested for burning the signs. And it's interesting to me, and also somewhat important, that it really registers to him how his behavior is affecting other people when it is in the context of his best friend, the person who he probably cares about the most, and the person who he cares about understanding the most, the person whose happiness means a lot to him. So realizing that his actions have a negative effect on someone he actively cares about definitely helped push the situation to a point that he managed to, the light bulb went off and he realized, like, oh, I messed up. This was the wrong thing to do. And you can also see that in that episode where he realizes that his behavior at the party, the party that happened off screen mainly, but abandoning Moomin at the party probably upset him. And he doesn't think about that during the party. During the party, the only thing that he's thinking about is he wants to escape. He wants to get away. He needs to have his space. But as soon as it's explained to him that his actions hurt someone else, he has time to consider how this affects other people and to realize that there's consequences beyond himself. And finally, I want to talk about Yonder. Moomin in episode 4 from season 1, Moomin Summer Madness. I always confuse it for Midsummer Madness. No, it's Moomin Summer Madness. He is very distressed when asking Snufkin where he's going. He runs up to him, he's out of breath, like, "Where are you going? You've only just arrived." And he is evidently distressed in that situation. And Snufkin doesn't acknowledge this. And I don't think it's because he doesn't care that Moomin is distressed. I think he just has a hard time realizing how much things really affect Moomin, how much his absence affects Moomin. I think he's aware that Moomin is affected by his absence. He can't possibly not be aware of that. But I don't think it's easy for him to realize in the moment exactly how much his absence really affects Moomin. And that's, again, something that I can highly relate to. I can understand that someone is upset at me not communicating with them. I'm really, really bad at contacting people over a long period of time because I just don't think that they need to talk to me. They know I exist. If they wanted to talk to me, they would make an effort to contact me. And it doesn't upset me, and sometimes I just forget that other people don't view communication that way. Sometimes I forget that my actions can have a much more devastating effect on other people than I register, because while I register that someone's upset, I might not register exactly how upset they truly are. And something similar is possibly happening with Snufkin, that he registers that Moomin is upset that he's leaving, but he doesn't quite understand the extent to which this upsets Moomin, or how distressed Moomin really was in that situation. So, this is all to say that he's not very good at reading people. And I think that most people would understand that being unable to read the room, being unable to read the situation, is a very autistic thing. Okay, some other symptoms. He has a very limited range of tone. He's not very expressive. He's much more expressive in terms of facial animation, and if he gets annoyed, there's a lot of expression. But his tone of speech is usually actually very controlled, very calm, very limited. And that's a very autistic thing as well. We are notoriously terrible at controlling our tone. I am the opposite. I get way too loud. I am very excitable, and I get incredibly loud without realizing it. But a lot of autistic people, they don't express emotion very readily, very vocally, very outwardly, because to them the emotion is on the inside. And that is something that I definitely see in Snufkin. He does express annoyance when he gets annoyed, but generally speaking, he is very internal with his emotions. He's very, I don't want to say monotone, because I'm worried if I say monotone, it would be offensive to the voice actor, but I think the voice actor did a fantastic job. I think Snufkin as a character is a little bit monotone, but I don't think that the voice actor did a bad job, if that makes sense. So that's another thing that I noticed. And also comforting repetition. I talked about this with during the pathological demand avoidance bit, but Snufkin has routines. He has incredibly strict routines, actually. He likes... his yearly routine is a very obvious one about how he travels around during the year, but the other thing is also he has a relatively stable day-to-day routine as well. Wake up, fish and or spend time with friends, spend time thinking, spend time writing or playing some music, make soup, eat the soup, go to bed. He camps in the same spot every single year. He meets Moomin on the same bridge every single year. He even has a sort of ritual on how to greet Moomin, which is, he's the one to initiate it, with the exception of, I think, in season 3, Moomin kind of does the Snufkin thing a little bit more than Snufkin does the Moomin troll. But he clearly has a set step-by-step thing that he does with how he's supposed to approach people, what he's supposed to do to greet people. And that's also going to come into masking, which I will get into a little bit. That'll be in the comparison part. But he definitely has things that he does repeatedly. I also wanted to bring up social exhaustion. So social situations that can be overwhelming. We know that it's overwhelming for Snork as well. We know that he prefers small gatherings over large groups, but it's unclear whether it's because of the social drain or if it is because of the overstimulation. Now, for Snork, I have a suspicion that it's more about the overstimulation. He doesn't seem to get nearly as socially drained when even in small groups of people, whereas Snufkin gets socially drained incredibly quickly, even in small groups of people. But on the flip side, Snufkin seems to handle larger groups more readily. So they're a little bit opposite in that sense. Like, Snufkin can handle a large group, but he gets socially drained regardless of whether he's in a small group or a large group, whereas Snork seems to be socially rather well balanced in terms of getting drained, but he gets overstimulated very easily with large groups. And both of which can be a way of expressing autism, and that'll again come up in the comparison section a bit more. And I also wanted to bring up playing music as a form of stimming. Now, people who don't know what stimming is a word used for intentionally creating a pleasant stimulation in order to induce comfort. So, clapping your hands, playing with your hair, it is a stimulation that self-soothes. It's an act of self-soothing, and it's very common in the neurodivergent community, but it's not exclusive to being neurodivergent. And playing music or singing is a very common form of stimming for people who are comfortable and or confident in doing that. And Snufkin plays a lot of music. That's not to say that everybody who plays music are stimming. It's just to say that I believe that Snufkin uses humming and playing his harmonica as a form of stimming, as a form to create a pleasant stimulation for himself that is comforting and makes him happy. I don't think he uses it as much when stressed, but it definitely does bring him comfort. Now, for the comparison bit, I don't know if it's really a bit, it's just going to be a little bit of me rambling about things. I would say that, aside from Snork being a classical presentation of autism and Snufkin being a more subdued and easy-to-miss presentation of autism, I think the other main difference between the two is that Snork comes across as someone who is aware that he is different and doesn't bother hiding it. He is comfortable in himself, he is aware that he isn't as well liked as he might be if he wasn't different, but he is accepting of the fact that he's different, and he kind of has a you either like me or you don't kind of approach to things. He is not going to change himself, even though he is aware that people view him differently. He is effectively a completely unmasked autistic individual. He is not putting up a front at all. He even has a hard time putting up a front. In my opinion, Inventing Snork is an episode where Moomintroll tries to teach Snork how to mask, and Snork just does not get it and refuses to adopt the entire concept. Snork does not mask. He is who he is, and he's comfortable with it, and you either accept him the way he is, or you don't, and it's your loss. You don't get to have Snork in your life. And I think that's incredible. I think that's very powerful. I think that's amazing for Snork. It's not the way that I do autism. And it's not a way that a lot of people do autism. I am incredibly envious of people who can express their autism and not hide it, but I also can't relate to that at all. So the other form, and it's not necessarily, it's not a binary. It's not a you mask or you don't mask. Like, there's so many levels of in between. But in terms of Snufkin to me reads as someone who is much more wary of how his behavior is interpreted by other people. He seems to be very conscious about what he says, what he does, whether or not he is upsetting someone. Snork is aware that what he is saying might upset someone, but he doesn't not do it because he thinks that what he's doing is the right thing to do and will make people more happy in the long run. Even if he is mistaken, even if he makes someone upset, he thinks that they should be happy, and therefore he will continue to do it, because to him, logically, if you say the truth, then happiness will follow. And that's not always the case, but it makes sense to him, and that's what he's going to keep doing. Snufkin, on the other hand, is not always in the moment aware of how his actions are affecting other people, but he is aware in a more general sense that what he says and how he says it affects people. A great example is when, in the episode, Season 1, Episode 3, The Last Dragon, the dragon bonds to Snufkin, and Snufkin doesn't want that to happen. He gives the dragon away because he says, don't you see, there's Moomintroll to think about. And he is clearly aware that if Moomintroll found out that the dragon had bonded to Snufkin, then that would make Moomintroll sad. He doesn't want Moomintroll to be sad, so instead he chooses to give the dragon away and lie to Moomintroll to keep Moomintroll happy. And you can actually see him psych himself up to tell this lie, to pretend to be calm, to pretend to not know anything about where the dragon went, before he does it. He slows down. When he sees Moomintroll coming, he looks down, he looks uncertain, he takes a deep breath, and then he proceeds. And to me, that is something that I highly relate to when it comes to masking and trying to figure out what people want and what would make them happy, and having to put on essentially an act every single day to present a form of yourself that is acceptable, to present a form of yourself that makes people comfortable and doesn't make them upset. A lot of the time, people who are artistic and highly masking are also people pleasers. We want to say and do the things that would make people happy, not because it comes naturally to us, like it does in a neurotypical person, but because we either genuinely enjoy having other people be happy, that's one of the reasons for me, but also because it's a defense mechanism, and we don't want the potential threat to ourselves to when we are perceived as different. The masking comes from rejection. Masking comes from not being accepted for the way that you are. Masking comes when people tell you that the way that you are being autistic is unacceptable. Snork comes across as a character who never experienced someone telling him that his behavior is wrong, or much more likely, not accepting their reasoning and not changing his behavior because of that. Whereas Snufkin comes across as someone who has encountered negative consequences for being the way that he is, and because of that has learned to make excuses or hide his true behavior in order to protect himself. He finds ways to avoid outwardly telling someone that he doesn't want to accept the responsibility instead of just telling them that, because he comes across as though he is almost afraid to do that. And he comes across as someone who isn't necessarily comfortable not masking because of the consequences that he might face. And this can be incredibly draining in a social situation where you have to actively pretend to not be autistic effectively. And that probably explains why Snufkin is far more prone to becoming socially drained than Snork. Because Snufkin is putting in a lot more effort with every single social interaction he has to come across as a normal person. And Snufkin also comes across as someone who has some underlying issues or trauma, things that he has to work through that is causing an underlying stress and anxiety, whereas Snork comes across as being happy or at least being content with who he is. And if I had to take a guess, if I was treating these characters as real people, and if I had to make an assumption of why they are the way they are, I would say that Snufkin, at some point in his life, likely some point in his early development, experienced consequences for his autistic symptoms, whereas Snork did not experience consequences for his autistic symptoms. Now, I have to be clear that when I say experienced consequences, I don't mean literally. I don't mean that Snork literally faced no consequences for his symptoms, and that he was treated and accepted by everyone. We know that he's accepted by Snork Maiden, but we also know that he doesn't have friends. What I mean by consequences is something that they themselves view as a consequence, as a punishment. Snork didn't view not having friends as a problem. He was content not having friends, quote-unquote not having friends. He was content in that situation, and he didn't view getting friends as a massive priority. So to him, being rejected for his autistic traits were not a punishment. It wasn't a consequence for his behavior. He experienced it and he accepted it, and that was part of how his life was, and he was okay with that. I don't know what type of consequences Snufkin might have experienced, which caused him to develop pathological demand avoidance, develop anxiety responses to his autistic symptoms, and to develop masking. I can speak from experience, the kind of things that someone might experience as a form of consequence. Sometimes you might have parental backlash, people telling you, like people you care about telling you off for your symptoms. Some people can experience physical or emotional punishment for their symptoms. Some people care more about having friends. They might have an emotional pain that they experience if they don't have friends, so they might modify themselves in order to gain friends. There are many, many reasons why someone might suffer consequences for their autistic behavior. But like I said previously, masking happens if you are forced to mask, if you are not accepted for your autistic behavior. So at some point in his life, Snufkin must have had at least one unpleasant experience where he learned that his way of thinking, his way of behaving, his way of expressing himself was unacceptable, and he needs to find ways to excuse it or hide it. And that's where masking comes from. And generally speaking, that's where pathological demand avoidance also comes from. You don't develop pathological demand avoidance if you are accepted and healthy and in a supportive environment. Pathological demand avoidance is a survival mechanism. It's a trauma response. So seeing that in another character, in someone else, indicates to me that at some point in their life, this character went through something that made them adverse to having control taken away from them. And I think those are the main differences between Snufkin and Snork. Snork is a character who didn't experience what he perceived as a lot of consequence for his autism, and because of that, he expresses it the way that he does. And Snufkin is someone who did experience what he perceives as consequences for his autism. And because of that, he has learned ways to hide his autism, and unfortunately, he has also developed some unideal trauma responses from that experience, or multiple experiences. And that pretty much sums up everything that I've noticed between the characters and the different ways that they express. I want to be clear, I absolutely love Snork. The party scene with the balloons, it's so relatable. I get overstimulated with too much noise sometimes. I think the main difference between the way I experience things in Snork is that I actually love music. I love loud music. I want there to be nice, loud, thrumming music a lot of the time, but I do get overstimulated with balloons because, exactly like he says, you know they're gonna pop, but you don't know when, and that is incredibly overstimulating. But I really love him as a character. I do not experience his special interest, his STEM special interest. My special interest is characters. I like people. I like analyzing people. I am having so much fun doing this. So I don't relate to his special interest, but I can definitely relate to having an obsessive, special interest to things, and I can definitely relate to not understanding what people want from you and trying to figure out things is difficult and it's frustrating. I can't relate to his refusal to mask, but I respect his refusal to mask. And on the other end, I love Snufkin. I love how Snufkin is portrayed. I love how I can see a lot of my own traits in him, and I love that he at least to me, comes across as autistic, but a completely different flavor of autism than Snork. And I think that is incredibly beautiful because there are so many different ways that autism can present itself. We're not a monolith. We're not a community of like-minded people. We're not a hive mind. We don't share ideas and agree on everything. Life is complex, and I absolutely love the diversity, and I just love these characters so much. And I think I should probably start shutting up now because I don't have anything new to say, and I'm gonna start repeating myself. So I will disappear, and I will say thank you for listening, and I will probably be making more videos because I have so many things that I want to talk about when it comes to Moominvalley. So yeah, hopefully, maybe, possibly, if I have the guts, you will be seeing possibly more of me, but for now, this has been over an hour worth of recording, and is mainly just me rambling. Thank you for sitting through it. Okay, love you, bye.